Great reformer, Martin Luther, once wrote, "I am afraid, but more than the Pope and all of his cardinals, I am afraid of my own heart." Now, at this time, Luther was under a death edict from the Pope, and he was terrified. But he wasn't afraid of the Pope, he was afraid of himself. Now, frankly, if I was under some sort of death warrant, or if I was being hunted by the most powerful person in the known world, I would be a little scared too. And yet, Martin Luther is not scared of any of that. He has this fear of himself. What is going on in here? And if you rewind a little bit, in the story of Martin Luther, you'll see him as a monk. Before anybody knew who he was, before the 95 Theses nailed on the door, just a monk. You might see him going around the monastery day after day, pounding his chest with his fist, saying, "My sin, my sin, my sin," as if he could beat his own heart into submission. He was afraid of his heart. Now, if you know any history at all, you're probably familiar with Martin Luther's impact, with what a towering historical figure that he was, the impact that he made not only on Europe, not only on Christianity, but all of Western civilization. His works and his writings came to shape the way that we think. The way that we think. The way our minds function. But what about the heart? Has he shaped the way our hearts function? And I'd say maybe he has. And maybe not for the better. I think Martin Luther was one of those figures that made Western civilization what it is today, a place that values the work of the mind, that values you if you know how to work with your mind, but can maybe make you afraid of your own heart. Martin Luther didn't embrace it, he didn't trust it, and if we're following in his example, if we are picking up what he's put down, then we might have trouble embracing our heart, trouble trusting our own heart. But why? So our readings this morning began with Song of Solomon. It's a love poem, isn't it? We see romance, we see longing and yearning in Song of Solomon. And some teachers trying to make sense of the Bible have looked at this book, Song of Solomon, and said, what is it even doing there? What are we supposed to do with this silly book full of romantic stories and poems and longing and getting up in the night and walking through the streets and all of this? What are we supposed to do with it? With these words that say, "Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." This is the language of the heart, believing in goodness not because there's a case to be made, not because there's some sort of argument supporting it, but believing in goodness out of pure conviction. You know because you know because you know. And if we're trying to get something out of the Bible that feeds our minds, we are going to struggle a little bit with Song of Solomon. The writer is the lover, speaking not just from the heart with sincerity, but speaking with the heart. He embraces it. He trusts it. And then our psalm from this morning flows right out of that, doesn't it? We see another love song, a love poem. In this case, though, it's a tribute to the king. It says, "You are the fairest of men. My heart is stirring with a noble song. Grace flows from your lips." It's this loving tribute to the writer's king, not written by a pundit, but by a poet. Not with the mind, but with the heart. He embraces it. He trusts it. Now, James, our second lesson, takes love in a new direction, doesn't he? He talks about love as compassion for the widow, for the orphan, for the helpless. This is what love is. This is what true religion is. There's that funny key phrase in our collect, true religion. What is that supposed to mean? But James brings this up to us that this is what love is. This is the work of the heart, is compassion. But religion has this way of deceiving the heart, doesn't it? And that's what James says. He's looking at, I guess, what he's calling false religion. Religion that deceives the heart and perhaps favors a different part of the body. So, sadly, I feel like I can relate to that. And some of you may know I went on a spiritual retreat last Sunday, and thank you again to those who helped make that possible, to Deacon Larry for officiating, to Aaron for preaching. And I went into this spiritual retreat with a certain intention, with thinking about who I was made to be. First of all, a whole person with a head and a heart like we all have. But I think I was maybe even more sensitive than average as a kid. I think I had a big heart and I had some big emotions to express. But society, little by little, programmed me out of that. Family and church and just the wider world, school and everything, taught me that if you want to be a valued person, if you want to be worth something, if you want to belong and be accepted, you better learn how to use this. And you better learn how to quiet what's happening here. And so in the spiritual retreat, I set my mind on listening to my heart. And what I gained from that, one of my big takeaways from that experience is, honestly, I have a little bit of a confession for you guys. And it's an ironic confession to make in the middle of a sermon where my job is to talk for 10 to 15 minutes, usually closer to 15, we'll be honest. But I learned that my mind did not want to cede control of me to my heart. Once it has power, it's not likely to want to give that up. And I knew that, but what is the practical outworking of that? And I think I discovered last weekend that my mind has a device. It has a dial that it can turn on me up and down, and that device is called words. As long as I keep talking, my mind doesn't have room, or my heart doesn't have room to speak. I can keep talking, and I don't have to be quiet long enough to listen to what's actually going on in there. So I have, in this last week, I've learned how to talk less. I'm serious. I know you all are looking at me like, no. Not our pastor. It's true. And in talking less, listening more, listening to what's happening around me more, listening to my own heart more. Because look at James, again, and what he says, be quick to listen, slow to speak. If people do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts. I think this is what he's saying. We tend to think of James as like, well, talk good and not bad. Like that's one of James's lessons. But I think what he's saying right now here is that we talk too much. Me, maybe most of all, but I think we all talk a little too much, and we drown out what God is trying to do in our hearts. And Jesus picks up on this in the gospel. He is so sick of people just talk. He says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. You guys know I was going to talk about the heart no matter what. this Sunday, and then look at what we got. Even the collect mentions the heart. But their hearts are far from me. And I think when we let our hearts stay distant and go silent, then we automatically miss the point of faith. That this is the point of faith, and Jesus makes that case over and over again. He makes it in this gospel passage, and he makes it elsewhere. That the heart is the locus of both sin and righteousness. He said it doesn't matter what's going into you. And of course, he's speaking spiritually, from your health perspective. It's good to think about what goes in you. But spiritually, you're not going to be defiled by what you choose to eat or what you choose to drink. It is what comes out of the heart. And he gives this long list of sins that can come out from the heart. And you could pair that with virtues that come from the heart as well. But what's going to come out of there if we're never listening? If we're keeping quiet about it? And James is echoing this. And it even makes me think back to the story of Martin Luther. Afraid of his own heart. I think on some level he knew this long list of sins. Of course he did. He knew the Bible. He knew Jesus said these 10 awful things come out of the heart. So Martin Luther just said, you know what? I'm just going to shut the door and quit listening. He had listened just enough to know these awful things that come out, and he said, if I quiet it, if I silence it, and I just talk, and write about 10,000 pages, which he did, then he's safe. But he's not, because the heart becomes a dangerous place when we silence it. It has a workaround, trust me. We can't keep it quiet forever. It will betray us. But on the other hand, when we open up our hearts, when we listen to our hearts, when we follow our hearts, like the poet, like the songwriter, when we learn to embrace what it has to say, when we learn to trust what it has to say, it becomes the source of all of this beauty, of all of this compassion, of the whole breadth and depth of human experience that Western civilization seems to want to tamp down and narrow to what we can define and what we can support with these 39 arguments, for instance. Because what matters happens up here. But Jesus is saying it isn't true. And as I've been trying to take this lesson in my own life from the spiritual retreat and forward, I have found myself functioning a little differently. This is the testimonial part of the sermon. I've found that instead of trying to fill up my life with words, trying to plug in all of those empty spaces, if it's not me talking, it's somebody else talking into my ear with a podcast or a radio show or a documentary or something. Got to fill it up with words. But instead, replacing that with music that lifts me up, or even just listening to the silence, listening to cicadas. Who else likes listening to cicadas, right? Just step outside, sit on the porch, go for a walk, listen to the crickets and the cicadas. And as that happens, I've found that it has been easier for me to listen to you, to listen to other people. I can sit there while someone talks without checking my watch or my phone or fidgeting. Fidgeting less, okay? I'm not going to promise no fidgeting. And it feels good. It feels stable. I start to feel like a whole person again. We have 4 writers with the 4 readings that we had this morning, all of them reaching across the centuries. None of them aware of what Martin Luther was going to do to us. Bless his heart. No pun intended, but that works. None of them knew what was going to happen to us with Western civilization, trying to elevate the mind and to value it to the exclusion of the whole rest of our body. They didn't know, and yet they had a sense. writing to generations to come to say, listen. Quiet yourself. Talk, and let it come to an end, and then hear your heart and what it has to say. What it has to say about you, what it has to say about the others around you and the needs that they are crying out for us to fill, and our own needs that we're crying out for others to fill. Listen. And my prayer for me, my prayer for us, is that we would listen to that. And we would, in prayer and in obedience to this message, to the message of Jesus and James and so many others, to find that balance between our head and our heart. Amen.